Hey everyone, Jeff from Programmer vs. World, and today in part 2 of our AEM Forms tutorial, we're going to look at the form editor and how it's used to make adaptive forms. If you remember in our last tutorial, we installed like the latest service pack to get us up to date in 6.4, and then we installed the Forms add-on pack. And that was really to give us some templates to work with. So today we're going to create a new form using one of those templates and just play with the editor a bit, and let me show you how the workflow works and where the things are in the editor. I don't think that we're going to have time to actually start building our form, but if you remember, what I wanted to do was convert this PDF guy right here over to adaptive forms, and that's what the plan structure is. In this video, we're just going to talk about the editor, the layout, and where everything is in it, and then in the next tutorial, we'll actually use the editor to build that form out. So if you're already familiar with the editor, you could probably skip this part. If you think you may learn something, hang around, and maybe I can show you something, which is doubtful. But okay, so if we go to forms, forms and documents, we'll see the content that was installed here when we added the form add-on pack. We're not going to talk about a lot of that. We'll just create a new adaptive form. We'll say create new adaptive form. Let's do basic because it has some stuff in it already, and we'll just call this the DVD order form. We only need to fill out the title and name really to create it. The theme Canvas 2.0 is fine. It's probably the cleanest one in there anyway, which is why it's the default. We don't need to fill out configuration containers or tags. Probably don't need to talk about this either, but a configuration container is just in case you wanted to have a specific form config that's unified throughout all your forms. It allows you to create like this global container and then put it here, and it gets really confusing really fast. Let's just stay simple for now. A form model, this is a way that you could actually bind existing lifecycle and XTP type data, XML schemas, or an actual data model that's bound to a database. Way advanced stuff for what we're going to be doing today. We're not going to deal with any of it. The document of record, we'll turn this on later. These are both options you can turn on after the fact. And we probably will turn on document of record generation just to show you that you can create a PDF when you're done. The whole idea here is to get away from that, but if you wanted to generate a PDF DOR, you can. And advanced just has published date and unpublished date, which deals with, well, publishing. Didn't need me to tell you that. I like to state the obvious. All right, so let's go back to basic. We have our title and name filled out. We'll just click create. If it seems like I'm going fast, it's because I've already worked through this once and it took 30 minutes to explain the editor, and believe me, I'm not going to take this long this time. I'm not dragging you guys through that. We can then click on our DVD order form and say edit, and in a separate tab it'll open up the editor. If for any reason your editor doesn't come up this way, it will come up this way. So let's talk about the very first option up here on the upper left-hand side. This actually toggles the side panel for the properties window. Sometimes mine comes up with it. I think it remembers, or maybe it has a cookie or something. So just be advised, if it comes up and you all of a sudden start freaking out that you have no controls, it's because this little guy right here is done this way. This is predominantly the most important window that we have here, and in my opinion, this is predominantly the most important view, which is why it's selected by default. This is the content view. It's very similar to an IDE's outline view or project view. It shows you the entire form recursively and how it's actually put together, and it can be confusing. Let me collapse all, which is what this thing does up here. Because in this case, we basically have a form which has a root panel inside of it. If I click that, it'll actually highlight it over on the right-hand side so you can see it. The root panel has a panel inside of it called General, which has 3 panels inside of it: Basic, Address, and Employment. So we have panels and panels and panels. So as you can imagine, without this style view, it can get confusing really fast. And of course, like I said, if you click on anything in here, it'll actually select the independent control on the right hand side. Now you don't have to do it from here. I could come over here and click this guy too, and it updates on the left as well. So they're interchangeable. This toolbar on the top gives you access to all the things you would want to do to a field. For instance, this is just a quick edit on the label, which allows you to change that value. This will actually open up like the properties window in an IDE, which just so happens to be the second most important thing over here, which is why it's number 2 in the list. This allows us to do the same thing. We could also change the label from over here. It doesn't necessarily matter. They're interchangeable. I can notice, oh, that was kind of important. Notice when I change something over here, it doesn't actually reflect immediately. What ends up happening is this check mark turns blue to let you know there's unsaved changes. We have to click that, and it'll, if you try to navigate away, by the way, it'll warn you that you have unsaved changes, so it is pretty intuitive. Let's go back to our view here. And there's just different types of controls on the form. Each one of them has a little bit different editor, but they all generally have the same properties, and most of which are self-explanatory. They have the basic setup for stuff like what your required fields would be, what your placeholder text is, if it's multi-line, is it rich text, blah, blah, blah. It also has regex validators for both the display and the validation pattern, which is unique. Normally we assume that they're all both the same, right? But by default, they're different. So if you say, well, this has to be a phone number, it's the same, you know, you can do things like that. Is there any way to take it off? No, I'll just hit this. Sorry, I shouldn't have been messing with that. You have help. The short description is just a tooltip that shows up in the preview. The long description, let's say this is a long description. The long description actually shows like a little guy right here, and if you click on that guy, let me show you the preview real fast as well too. If you select a form and you say preview as HTML, it'll open up another tab that'll actually show you the live preview of what the form looks like. And this is the easier way to look at your changes. You could use this preview button up here to swap this over, but I find that the editor swapping in and out of preview just takes too long. So we can look now and click this little guy, and this is what happens when you do a long description. A short description is the tooltip that pops up over top of the name. So it can be a little gotcha to not know what those things are, but a little bit of experimentation. You can always say, always show short description, which doesn't necessarily do what you may think. What it does is it puts it underneath there. It doesn't keep the tooltip up at all times. So those are 3 behaviors of the help content that you just need to be aware of. And accessibility allows you to choose which property you actually want the screen reader to read, which is nice. And you know, so every control on here may differ by a little bit. For instance, a date, of course, will ask you stuff like this. What you want the placeholder to be, what the names to be, blah, blah, blah. But generally, this is the main place where you configure components, and almost everything you do over here will end up popping this window back. The third item in this window is the asset chooser. This comes into play for a few reasons, mainly if you want images on your form, but more importantly is if you're building fragments, form fragments, and you want to drop these reusable pieces on and off your form. This is the place where you go and search for those and find them. There are a lot of things that can be brought onto a form. I'm not 100% sure I agree with most of them, like, well, why does a video need to be on a form? Well, they gave you the capability, but it's there. Products and weird stuff. All right, so we'll get into this much later. This 4th button down is the place where you add your components, and believe it or not, this is all there is. And that's all. Sorry, scrolling that window. That should be nice on the audio. This is really all there is, and really all there needs to be. If you come into a situation in which you think you may need to create a component to accomplish something, I would rethink it, because these are really just PDF forms that are being put on the web. They're not applications. And if you need to create a composite where 3 or more fields interact with one another, there is a way to do that already. And that's pretty much what the rules designer is for. So, but without further ado, these are the controls that you can drag onto a form. There are targets on a form. For instance, this basic component target right here. You could kick plus. You could click plus and add it from right here, or you could just say, I want to bring some text over there. I'm just going to drag it there, and the same applies. I could edit the text by coming in here, or, well, that's actually kind of wild because it was a text component. It really didn't expose its stuff there. It allows you to do it here. We'll say that's not good. It's not proper punctuation. Let's put the period in there. And that's how that works. And the last section is for data sources, which is a pretty advanced topic, but it is possible that you may want some of these pull downs, let's say a state, to actually be bound to some other service or database or something. I remember in 6.3, there were 3 core data source types. There were database through connection pool, there was a REST endpoint, and there was a remote RPC endpoint. Those were all you could do. We'll explore those later. In 6.4, this may have changed. I know they're connecting to Adobe I/O runtime a lot more in a lot of the components that they're doing. So maybe it's different, maybe not, but we're dragging off topic. Let's go back to our content view. Let me check on my time, 10 minutes. I got 5 minutes to get through the rest of it so I don't bore you guys to death. The next window over is for page information. This will take you back to the main property screen for the form that we were filling out earlier when we created it. Of course, like everything in AEM, you can start a workflow or open it in Classic UI. This is an undo button. This is the same touch UI emulator that allows you to look at what your form or your content's going to look like in multiple views and go into landscape mode and yada, yada, yada. It's no real different from the component editor in that regard. And at the same time, we have the same general modes that you do on a normal component touch UI screen. We have the ability to stay in edit mode. Style mode is kind of unique, and you'll notice design mode is missing from this specific form. So these 3 modes, we're in edit mode, which basically means we have access to the editor. If we go into style mode, what happens is when we click on a form field, is it waiting on a refresh? No. When we click on a form field now, we can actually modify the styling information from it. We can aggregate this stuff together later to form themes, but if we go into developer mode, really what we're looking at is our alert console along with the loading times and some other information to help us make decisions about how the form is actually being created. We'll use this a little bit, especially if we have alerts. You'll see that I'll go over here just to see what the alerts are. If there are really serious things happening, you'll find an alerts tab will be available here 9 times out of 10, so you won't have to go over there. And last but not least, there's a preview button which does the same thing. See, this is what I don't like about it. That error is sort of misleading as well too. There really wasn't one. It's the same thing as just coming over here and hitting refresh, which to me is faster. See, like here's the text that we added. Switching back and forth to and from edit and preview in this editor is just too painful. So as you can imagine, it's easier if you just go into straight preview mode. This is what, for instance, the customer would see anyway after the form's published. So it's easier just to hang out in here and refresh than it is to switch back and forth. And of course, at the bottom of this form, wow, if I can get there, there's a toolbar. These buttons are pre-configured: reset, save, submits, and they're all found right here. But you can add a button to it and then create your own activities that you want it to do by using a script. Basically, it's JavaScript, but it's inside a bridge. It's inside a sandbox, which keeps it relatively unexposed to the outside world. This is something we will get into later when we start handling certain routines like options and events like validate and a few other things later through custom code. One last comment on this content window, which I just so gratefully deem the most important window here, is you can drag and drop and rearrange things in here. For instance, if we decided we didn't want expenditures to be the second tab, it seems like that's something that would be, you know, way down here. We can actually drag it, and if we wait long enough for the form to refresh, or is it? Yeah, it is. Okay, so you have to be really careful touching this after you make a big move like that. Just give it a few seconds to, let's collapse all. Now expenditures second to the last where it's supposed to be. You can also say, like, in general and basic information, for some reason I think date of birth is more important than gender. You can move it around. You can also do things like, there's 2 different types of date controls. You can say, this is crazy, I don't want them to enter this. Instead, I want to use a picker. I can turn around and click on these triple ellipsis, and I can say replace and make that a date picker, and it moves the things over along with the properties. Now if I refresh, this is a date picker instead of being the thing that I have to enter. And the interesting quirk with this is it shows an image there, but in preview it's actually missing, and it's this. And I know that confuses customers, so it's one of the style things that you have to work out. Anyway, that's essentially how the editor works. One important note, which confuses a lot of people, is if I'm editing any field, this thing up here, which is a name, and let's say I have OCD and I want that to be first name text box. This is actually the name of the node in the JCR that this is stored under. And while it's not crucially important that you clean these up, it does help later. And the reason being is when you get into scripting, this is the ID or the name that's actually used, even though they have sort of their own IntelliSense, which will write this instead to keep it in plain English for you. This is actually what's being used behind the scenes. So later when you start getting heavy into scripting, it makes your life a lot easier if you use good names up front. And that is essentially the editor. And that's where we will be through the majority of these tutorials. And it seems like, well, this is awful simple, but you do have things like a rules designer in here, which is an IDE all by itself, where you can create some pretty interesting rules, or you can just flip straight over to code and start writing script inside of it. So it is by itself an IDE hiding in here, which is really powerful. It also has some interesting validation and other things that can be done. And before we end this, what are we on time? 17 minutes. So let me spend one more minute explaining to the root panel and the form container. So the root panel has a little bit different properties than the other two panels. The root panel itself, you can't delete. There's no way to delete it. And it controls what the layout's going to be for other panels inside of it. In this case, we've said that we want tabs on the left for all subpanels, but we don't have to do that. For instance, we could just change that to an accordion and put it all on one page if we wanted to, and now it's an accordion. If we refresh this, it's not real intuitive, but at least it's an accordion now. So we can control a little bit of what this layout's going to look like by this guy. But if we want to control what happens when we submit it and what the overall theme is, we can do that from the form container, which allows us to, we can select a theme. Let's select one, Liberty. What is that all about? Okay, that's very government-ish. Canvas 2.0 is the cleanest that to develop in, and it's also the fastest to load. So I usually leave it there until I'm done, and we figure out what to do later. But it allows us to figure out pre-fills, how we're going to pre-fill forms, what our client library include category is going to be for pulling in CSS that we can use everywhere if we want to customize stuff. Field layouts, do we want the label on top? Do we want it on the side? What happens when we submit it? Does it autosave? How do we do electronic signatures? What metadata gets submitted? All of this is in the top level of the form. Probably the most important part is what to do when we hit the submit button. By default, it's set up to submit to a REST endpoint that goes nowhere. 9 times out of 10, what's going to happen is you're going to submit to a workflow or invoke a form workflow. But these are all things to keep in mind. Is these top two levels of the content, form container and root panel, don't behave the same way as everything else. But everything underneath it, for instance, general, is just a normal panel, and it moves on from there. And that's it. That's basically it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll actually start building out our project form out. Remember, we found this guy online and had a lot of improvements that we could do to it. So we'll start building this guy out. And in the tutorial after that, we'll get into showing and hiding fields and using the rule designer and some other stuff. So we'll try to work in steps, and I'm trying to stay under 15, 20 minutes if I can. So I'm going to get out of here, but remember to subscribe if you want to be first to see these things as they're released. And I'm trying to do at least every other day now that the kids are back in school and I can actually have some quiet time to go ahead and knock these out. So remember to subscribe if you want to get the new content as it's being released. And I'm Jeff, and this is Programmer versus World, and I'll see you guys later. And I'm out.